I'll come to the last question. I thought we should end with a bang rather than a whimper. So it's going to be about the social and cultural issues. Before the election, there was a lot of discussion about that there are these two sort of faces to the BJP. There's the Hindutva side, and then there's the development side, which Prime Minister Modi really sort of played up in the campaign. And there was a big question about which is going to be dominant. And I think Pratap has written quite a bit on this, that maybe one thinking was that once in power, it's the development and the delivery on the economic front that will sort of become the major imperative. Now, looking back at the last 2 years, we have seen a lot of controversy in the press. So we have seen things like, the beef, the Dadri incident, then what's happening in institutions, universities. So there's one criticism, which is that Hindutva is raising its head too much and is creating distraction, as is standing in the way of the other agenda. So I want to know what you think about that. The other thing which has come up recently is that Shekhar Gupta, who was a tremendous talent for words, he called it a talent account deficit of the current government. Basically, the idea that appointments to critical positions are driven too much by ideological and loyalty tests rather than technocratic skill. So Raghuram Rajan's departure and the controversy over, let's say, the appointments at the Film Institute and so on. Chetan Chauhan as the fashion czar, apparently. So all of this, so the criticism being that ideology is now so paramount, especially the cultural nationalism ideology, that it's really hollowing out the government of talent. So on these two aspects, I want to know what your assessment is. Let me just throw in, especially, on this question, we'll particularly feel Ashok Malik's absence. So let me.
I will ventriloquize.
Why don't you go first? No, you go first. But let me just point out something which Ashok might have said here, which is that it's not like previously we didn't have any of this stuff, right? So the beef bans were done by Congress government. Section 66A wasn't done by this government. So we have had illiberal social traditions, illiberal institutions. So maybe it's unfair to pick out this government too much on that front. The other thing also is, with respect to this question of talent account deficit, the previous government was criticized for the National Advisory Council being too homogeneous, right? The standard thing was full of cholawalas and so on and so forth. So maybe previous governments have also done the same thing. They have failed to build a sort of cabinet of rivals, so to speak. So while you answer the question and the charges, I also want you to compare a little bit with what has been going on in the past. So,
big issues again. Let me take the talent issue first. It's not that the UPA was bubbling with a lot of talent either. But yes, I think this particular government, just if you look at the cabinet, now it's about, 80 odd cabinet members. Looks like a talent deficit there. There are some ministers who are doing reasonable work. But to me, it's a larger issue. And it is particularly in the sphere of education. There have been, the state in India is disastrously intrusive into education for many decades. And so it's not that it started now. But having said that, let me mention two things. One is that even in the earlier regime, when they were rewarding loyalty, making appointments which are politically motivated, etc., it seems for various sociological reasons, this supply of what I call an unending supply of bigots, charlatans, and morons that this government can mobilize is really unbelievable. Not that, by God, charlatans, morons were not there in the UPA regime, but this government's talent in that is incredible. And particularly what is happening in the higher education, which is supposed to bring our more talented people there, is really, what is the expression that Pratap used in a different context? Walking disaster. I think it is a walking disaster. But in general, yes, you are right. The banning cow slaughter has been there for a long time. Soft Hindutva of the Congress has been there for a long time. But there's one thing to ban cow slaughter, another thing to go in somebody's house, open the fridge, whatever meat you see, call it beef, and kill somebody is different. Lynching and vigilante violence that is going on is, I would not say unprecedented, but is really qualitatively different from what we used to have. All I would say, cultural field, what has happened is unpardonable. It does not mean I'm an apologist for either earlier regime or regimes in other countries. I'm not an apologist for them, but I'm appalled by the extreme decline of quality of democracy in India. Institutional decay in our democracy has been going on for some time. It's not that it suddenly happened, but to me, it's accelerated even in the last 2 years. Let me stop there.
Let me intro. I mean, look, as you know, I agree with what Prananda said, but I think again we need to ask somehow. So let's just stipulate a lot of bad stuff happened in the past. I mean, the point was governments were changed to improve things. I mean, there's no point going over that. I think the two things. So this talent question, I actually don't understand that question. I mean, as you yourself indicated, I'm not sure whether talent is an ex-ante assessment or an ex-post assessment. UPA had brilliant people who were total disasters, actually laid the seeds for pretty long-term ruination. I'm not sure what it means, talent. I mean, you know, one can name names, but I think we need to have a more nuanced debate over this talent business, what talent means, what are the structures under which talent is actually allowed to function and not function. But I think two things are very, very clear and obvious. There is a distinctively majoritarian hue to this government that is getting more ominous by the day. Whether it expresses itself in overt acts of violence or in sort of subtler cultural forms, that's an open question. Statistically, we can argue it's one incident through, and you know, you could argue statistically it doesn't actually look too bad, but the point about statistics is it's telling you yesterday's story. It's not telling you what is the underlying anxiety that a set of policies and interventions are actually unleashing, right? And I think those are in a sense growing by the day. There is a question about what's happening to the quality of democracy, and you know, again, the global story here is interesting. I mean, to be honest, you know, you look at the United States in the last 6 months, and you just wonder, right? What kind of a moment where I mean, it's truly astonishing, actually, right? Now, has that to do with something about the particular structures of communication, this moment that has kind of, you know, partly by actually completely erasing the distinction between public and private. In fact, all liberal societies rest on that distinction. When there is no distinction between a private chat and public, what that underlying institutional story is, part of that, it certainly contributes. But I think two things we can say categorically, which is whatever these underlying social forces, the Prime Minister has done nothing. Speeches in Congress notwithstanding, interviews to Arnab Goswami notwithstanding, has done nothing to set a moral tone that would counter these tendencies that are bubbling up. I mean, I think that you can say as a matter of fact. Now, what he intends, what he does not intend, who knows what's in his mind, right? I think the second thing you can say, I think, very safely with the UP election coming up, you are more likely to see communalization. And given the global context, I mean, given this kind of the way we reason by association, ISIS, Kashmir, all of that, Bangladesh, all of that, the ideological ground for that communalization being overtly acceptable is more propitious now than it was 5 years ago. I mean, I'm putting it as blandly in a sense as I can. Those two things I think are almost certainly true. The one thing I will say, just not to go back to UPA, but the really interesting question is which political party is going to stand up against this? And to give you one example, when the JNU controversy broke out, many of us asked lots of congressmen, you know, you're going to visit Pranab Mukherjee, you're giving a petition, Rahul Gandhi is going to JNU. Are you willing to sign up as a matter of principle to a new Charter of Freedom? Says, look, whatever the context, First Amendment, sedition laws, we are willing to make a new start on this institutional frame. Right? Where do you stand on the law of sedition? Right? Where do you stand on 295 of IPC? Does it need more safeguards? Right? The real tragedy is no political party had the courage or conviction to say that we actually want to take a stand on that issue. That is actually what worries me more. I mean, which is you know, the worst are full of passionate intensity, and the best have absolutely no conviction at all. Because I think that the articulation of the tolerance debate ultimately has to take an institutional form, right? The institutional form is, I mean, we can throw Nehru, Gandhi, Congress ideology, history, but the institutional form is, do state institutions discriminate in their daily operations? Can you trust the police not to randomly pick up people of certain ethnic communities? Is the structure of law going to actually provide you protection? And it is true, statistically, the Congress party used more sedition cases than actually this does. So we need to move it out now from this Congress-BJP divide into those who actually stand for freedom and those who, in a sense, let's put it this way, stand for manipulative politics, which cuts across party lines.
Okay, so there are, well, this is a sort of largish question, but let's just make 3 brief points. The first is that it is, there was, as you said, there was this idea that there is BJP is development or Hindutva, and you know, which will it be? And it was a fundamentally misguided and pointless question. And it simply missed the fact that for the average person in the BJP and for a large number of voters of the BJP, there was no difference. You know, I think if you asked Mr. Modi what his image of the future was, of a future India is, and he'd say strong, Hindu, and rich. And there'd be no difference between those 3 things. You'd be strong because you're Hindu, you're rich because you're strong because, etc., etc., etc. Those things are linked to each other. I mean, the reason that I always make this point is that sometimes, you know, in the way that people use words and the oppositions they set up are revealing. And the opposition I like to talk about is, you know, development versus vote bank politics. Have you noticed that's the opposition? Those are the big. There is absolutely no similarity. They're on orthogonal things. All right, these are 2 different categories. But how is it that one development is the opposite of vote bank politics? Precisely because you are strong, Hindu, and rich, and that's your future. And that's one category. So it is absurd to imagine that there is any difference in the minds of the government or the Prime Minister, of many people in charge, that you know, there is one face that they have to show and another face. It's not. Second, well, I think I have to sort of disagree with Pratap on some level. When he says that you know, the Prime Minister has done nothing to set a moral tone, I'm actually thankful for that. Because I would suspect that his instinct would be with the vigilantes. And the fact is that now he is in a position where, because of the history of the post, etc., 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 he is telling himself, no, this is not something on which I should give you my immediate response. All right? This is actually something where I should sort of step back, maybe not say anything, maybe, you know, wait in 3 weeks later. Thank heavens for that. All right? Because my suspicion is that if you were to wake him up in the middle of the night and ask him to give a speech immediately about this subject, the outcome would not be what you want. So don't ask for it. So, I mean, let us be thankful, in fact, that he has that sort of sense of position in place, that he is actually saying to himself, this is my job, let me take it seriously, let me not step in, let me not wade into everything all the time. And the third thing, now this is where I think I will ventriloquize Ashok a bit. So yes, of course, things are a little different now. Things are a little bit more majoritarian now. If you take the sort of longer sweep of things, it is surprising that we weren't majoritarian already. How is it that we were this strange anomaly of a supposedly secular democracy, we're nominally secular democracy, in a situation and in a part of the world and in context when it should have been difficult or near impossible? It just so happened that there was a particular kind of elite that was always divorced from the rest of the country, all right, that took over, that inherited the state that the British Raj left them, and then ran it according to the principles that they believed in. They made very little effort to spread those principles to the rest of the country because they inherited the British Raj's contempt for the idea of proselytizing liberalism. So they chose to create their enclave of liberalism and not go beyond that. And now, eventually, that 70 years of happy, blissful insulation has ended, as it inevitably would. So what are we complaining about?
Can I disagree? This is a very important point, right? With both of right. So particularly in the last one, right? Because this is a kind of, you know, this sort of Marxist historiography of the Nehru years, which everybody converges on, this thin elite at the top. So the two things I disagree with. One, if India remains secular, it will not be because of the elitists, and it never was. It will be because of common vernacular adjustments. Okay? That's the point that this story misses out. The second point that this story misses out, and you know, you just have to read a description of Jawaharlal Nehru during an election campaign. You know, D.P. Mishra, right? This big critic of Jawaharlal Nehru, hates Nehru's guts, called Nehru's a dictator. And you know, we were accustomed to this historiography. Nehru was a bourgeois, the last Englishman, these bunch of common law lawyers, right? Nehru on a campaign trail. And D.P. Mishra is putting all his might in Madhya Pradesh, where he had reason to be sore. And he asked this question: if this is a distant, anglicized, whatever, why is it that these millions are reposing their faith in him? Right? This wasn't an elite. That was an elite that did actually make a democratic connection in a certain way. Right? And which is to say that I think there is a work to be done by a certain kind of politics here. It is not a sociological overdetermination, thin elite, masses of these, you know, illiterate majoritarian people, and finally they've actually come to center stage. Even now, I think as Shiv Vishwanathan pointed out in a wonderful article about the way in which, I think Mir is right, we set up all kinds of awkward oppositions. The same guys that vote authoritarian in the morning were willing to vote anarchism in the afternoon, right? So if Indian secularism will be saved, I don't think the issue is going to be, in a sense, this elite mass distinction. It is that there was, I mean, a lot of complicated factors. There was a political ideology. It happened against the backdrop of two massive failures, partition and actually the assassination of Gandhi in a curious way gave us a lot of political cover for a number of years to delegitimize a certain kind of majoritarianism. But it was because of a certain form of that vernacular kind of adjustment. And I think we do politics, Indian history, and the cause of secularism a disservice by keep mouth, sort of that same old thing, you know, little elite. Of course, all societies have elites.
But I'll say the difference is that our, as I said, our society's elite did not attempt to transfer its values onto the rest of the country. So I would strongly disagree with you when I say that the future of Indian secularism is vernacular adjustment. I think vernacular adjustment has run its course. And it's run its course for very, very good reasons. It's because the natures by which these communities and sections spoke to each other have now decayed.
Yeah, that I agree.
All right? And so if and I'm not taking any responsibility away from the leadership when with the past leadership when I say that it's because of its inability to try and spread liberal values for disinterest in trying to spread liberal values for all these years that we're in the situation that we still have a thin elite. So, I mean, the counter example that I always give is about, you know, France in the 60 years to laicity, whatever may be wrong with it, right? But you had 60 years of the Third Republic when you probably can't name a single prime minister, you probably can't name a single politician, all these little men of forgettable consequence. But all they did was create an educational system that spread their values down, you know, into a fundamentally Catholic country, and it transformed it in 50, 60 years. We did not attempt it. Whether we did, whether we should have, whether we should not have, is a different question. But we didn't attempt to.
Your international comparison would be Turkey. So we are more on the lines of
Turkey
Turkey.
also, I think, did not really try in the
Yeah,
interior.
yeah. So we are similar
Exactly.
to Turkey.
Exactly.
Prananda, reactions?
I also disagree with him basically, but very on similar lines as Pratap said. And I would endorse, Pratap talked about the elite point of view, etc., the Nehru, the image of Nehru, etc. But let me go back to Pratap's first point. It is not liberalism. The mass thing is not liberalism. But there was a fundamental secularism. You know, to this, until very recently, I don't know the current situation, in Ajmer Sharif, the number of Hindu pilgrims is almost as many as Muslim pilgrims. So at that level, there was a kind of commonality. Secular probably is not the right word. There's a commonality of tolerance and acceptance that was there. Yes, our elite probably should have used it for more, but it's not liberal values. Quite often our masses are not liberal. In a sense, Gandhiji captured this much more than the other two leaders who also talked about these secular values. One is Nehru, the other is in a different field, not politician, is, I would say, Rabindranath Tagore. So Tagore, Nehru, and Gandhi, these are the three thought leaders of India, in which what I am now talking about, I'm also actually a great supporter of both Nehru and Tagore, but I would say Gandhiji captured this mass level of tolerance, and just remember what Gandhiji, otherwise a highly religious person, what he talked about eating beef.
Yeah, that was exactly where you saw that in operation. I'll try to.
Can I
Yeah.
just I mean, look, I don't think we disagree, but I think two things. So the sense in which I agree with Meher and Prananda is that it was not liberal toleration. In fact, that conception of toleration was very hierarchical and segmented. Each community has a place so long as it stays in its place. And one way of thinking about it is the kind of toleration that a modern society requires is one that requires the breaching of boundaries, not the maintenance of boundaries, right? I absolutely, in a sense, agree with that. That process is, in a sense, sort of, needs to be long and so. But I don't think the fundamental issue, and I think that's why these comparisons with France and Turkey, I think, are a bit problematic, is fair in the sense that the single biggest source of intolerance in any society, in modern ideologies, right, has been around the question of nationalism, right, which is the simple question, who gets to be benchmarked as member of a community or not? And frankly, I don't think Western democracies are a particularly great model for that. None of them, right? They all enacted their nationalisms after ethnic cleansing, or France still has difficulty with, right? Now, nationalism as a particular political form. And that's the problem we are still struggling with, is once you give leeway to the question, who is an Indian? That question is a trap, right? And I think what we have to, in a sense, understand is that, I mean, in fact, it's not so much the elite mass, not even secular religious that captures it. It is what are the specific political dynamics through which nationalism takes one particular form rather than another, right? And that is far more contingent and far more fragile, as we are seeing across the world at the moment. I don't think that articulation of nationalism depends upon these kind of irrevocable sociological predestinies. And one of the things about nationalism is that it has notoriously not been able to, does not lend itself to that kind of sociological overdetermination that many other ideologies do.